Hey, Sarah.
Yes, Alex?
When's the last time you updated your dating profile?
You're supposed to do that?
Yeah, I do mine at least once a day, whether it needs it or not.
Welcome to Mistakes Were Made, a podcast about non-monogamy for messy people like us. I'm Sarah. I'm queer. I'm non-monogamous. I write stuff. I therapize people. I avoid dating apps and then complain about never meeting anyone.
And I'm her husband, Alex. I have a master's in communication, so I microanalyze every corner of my own and other people's online dating profiles.
And I'm Jessica, here producing, resident monogamist for the podcast. And you know, guys, I can remember a time not too long ago when you thought that looking over my shoulder and swiping through my Tinder matches was like the best entertainment in the world.
I'm so sorry.
Now you know.
Now I know. And today we're welcoming a guest to the podcast to help us understand our online dating angst, pull back the curtain on how the dating apps work or don't work for poly people, and hopefully give us some pointers on improving our experiences and maybe my attitude. Riki Thompson is a researcher, educator, consultant, and public speaker. She's also an associate professor of digital rhetoric and writing studies at University of Washington, Tacoma. For the past 2 decades, she's been researching communication and technology to understand how some people find belonging and connection through digital technologies, while others experience marginalization and exclusion in online environments. For the past 5 years, she's been researching online dating and swiping culture to understand the complexities of communication and digital literacies in the modern day search for love, sex, and connection. As a specialist in language, gender, and sexuality studies, a good deal of her work focuses on LGBTQ+ issues and the experiences of people who practice ethical, consensual non-monogamy and those who identify outside of traditional binary gender categories. Hi, Riki. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited for you to be here. I know we all have so many questions for you, but I feel like a lot of them could just be summarized, at least on my end, with help me.
Yeah.
Well, lucky for you, I do one-on-one coaching if you need help too. So there you go.
That's awesome. Oh my gosh, that's such a good idea. All right, we'll get into that
We're
too.
going to try and get it for free.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we started this podcast.
I will
Riki.
give a discount code at the end of the episode for people who are listeners to Mistakes Were Made.
So you've studied this stuff a lot in an academic context, but we were talking about before we started recording that you also have personal experience that you're drawing on as well, right? Can you
Yes.
say a little bit about that? You're not just a researcher.
Yes, I do not just sit and watch from outside and see the polyfolk as if they are animals to be observed. I also am a polyfolk. I'm also queer, and I've been online dating since 2015, before I started this research, but truly I was already starting the research, I just didn't know it. I did not know I was non-monogamous at the time. I actually was introduced to poly through somebody I was dating that I met on one of the apps, which will bring me to one of the things we can talk about later about all the newbies out there. So I had been recently single for probably a year or so, and I was talking with a friend of mine about how do people who are sexually non-normative in any way, like people into kink, people who are swingers, people who are poly, how do they find each other nowadays? I knew within the queer community, flagging has been a thing for a long time. There's lots of ways. There's niche apps that are specially for lesbians or for gay men. So I thought, okay, but what about the other people out there who have different sexual practices? And so, of course, being a researcher, I started doing research. And I found this article that was like, well, there's an app for everything, right? And it went through the list of like every kind of sexually non-normative app, like these kink ones. Ashley Madison was on there at the time for the cheaters. And then there was one called Thrinder for threesomes and moresomes. And I thought, really, Thrinder, that sounds fascinating. So I thought, I want to see how this works. And I was also really curious what people put on profiles. I'd never been on a dating app. And I'm thinking, as a sexually forward, sex positive kind of app, are people going to have just all nude photos? Are they going to have kinky photos? Is it going to be just completely sexual? Do I need to prove I'm over 18? I didn't know. So I decided to go in, I download the app, and of course now I have to set up a profile to actually see how the app works. So I'm like, okay, I've never set up a profile, so I just put in like one photo and like a little line. And then I start kind of swiping through, and I was like, oh, there's lots of very vanilla kind of commentary, right? Very non-sexual, like, oh, I'm looking for a companionship, or I'm looking for a triad. And then there's people who are just looking for swing partners. And then there was also plenty of photos and stuff that were, and bio information that was also very explicit, but not everybody. So now I started kind of thinking, well, this looks like some pretty cool people on here. Maybe I'll update my app. So I updated my profile a little bit more. Like you, Alex, every day. And then I matched with a couple people and I started talking to them. And so I start talking to this guy and he tells me he's polyamorous. And I'm like, well, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, it was a 2-hour conversation while I was driving through California, learning everything there is to know from this poly person who I've not met in person yet, but I've become fascinated by. And I eventually did end up in a long distance relationship for years with this person, but I came home and started reading, and I reached out to a friend and she's like, hey, have you read The Ethical Slut? I think you need to. Have you read Opening Up? Here's another one for you, More Than Two. And I started researching, and as I was reading, I was like, oh my God, this makes so much more sense to me. And I did not realize, I just didn't realize I was so enculturated into monogamy my whole life that this was an option. And so I became very intentionally dating that way. And now I was on Thrinder, which, by the way, is now called Field.
Because that's what
those are that's the origin of Field.
Yeah, they got sued by Tinder for name infringement, copyright stuff.
That.
Yeah, so I was one of the early birds on Field back when it was Thrinder. And eventually then I got on some other apps and I started kind of exploring. And then I was dating somebody, and we were looking at my Metamors profiles together, the three of us at the kitchen table. Little did I know I was actually kitchen table poly. I hadn't quite figured that out yet either. And as I was helping her with her profile, she's like, do you do research on this? Because I would pay you for this kind of help. And I thought, why am I not researching this? I study online identity. I study how people find connection through discussion boards, through blogs, through online spaces. I study belonging. It all made sense. I study visual rhetoric. So there I was. Oh, I guess I have a new research project. And so that's how I got into this. And it's kind of funny that I'm a good example of somebody who was introduced to poly through the dating apps. Mm-hmm. And then I ended up studying them. So I'm immersed. I'm very immersed. I took a hiatus from dating on the apps for a few years while I was collecting data for my book project.
Interesting.
Because I realized I could not separate my work brain from my personal brain. I worried that people would think that I was trying to recruit them when I wasn't. Or once I was talking to them, I now wanted to recruit them because their profile and their messaging was so fascinating. And I thought, nope, I can't do that either. And then I was also interviewing people. I interviewed over 100 people over a few years. And all of a sudden I was getting people, I would interview somebody and they would send me other people. And now my whole schedule was packed. My Google Calendar looked like a poly dating calendar, but it was all interviews. So I just realized at that point, my job was one of my other partners at the time, and I had no space outside of the one relationship that had continued. I was dating a few people at the beginning, and then the pandemic happened. We also had that, right? So there was a lot of complexity. But I have returned to the dating apps this year now that I am not collecting any more data and I'm finishing writing my book. So it's been interesting to also return after being off the apps for a few years and only seeing them from the perspective of my participants. Sometimes I would go back into an app and just kind of see how it was working based on something they'd said that I didn't realize was a change in the functionality of an app. But in general, I wasn't feeling that sense of what it's like to be out there online dating as a poly person for a while. And so it was a good re-entry to be reminded of all the things.
Yeah, I'll bet. So just backing up for a moment, I guess a question I have is it safe to say that you're probably one of the experts on polyamorous online dating and trends?
I'm realizing this is true.
Yeah.
What's kind of funny is when I started this research, I was just like looking at online dating in general. And as I've done more and more stuff, I've realized there's not a lot of people who are doing work around non-monogamy, and definitely not around non-monogamy and online dating. Most of the kind of, I've been contacted for interviews more often around my expertise around poly online dating and trends around poly relationship changes. So yeah, it's kind of a funny thing to realize when I look around, I'm like, oh, there isn't a lot of research on this yet. There is somebody who does a lot around poly community. There are a number of people who are looking at communication around non-monogamy or around poly specifically, or around mental health, but I haven't seen many people. Very little. Very, very little.
It seems to me like this is an example of just like research and academia like struggling to keep pace with a trend. So maybe a year and a half ago, I wrote an article about like the trends in non-monogamy increases in the practice and especially in this region. And it felt like there was so little just like numbers research to draw on.
Yeah.
But I feel like the trends are heading up and people are just like really scrambling to try and keep up with that.
Yeah, I wrote an article last year. It was in The Conversation, and it was defining what is a polycule. And I was contacted by the editor because I'd already written a piece about poly in the pandemic, dating, what we can learn from poly people during the pandemic, because poly people had already figured out how to navigate really like conversations around STIs and networks of people.
Consent.
And consent, yes, and talking about difficult stuff. So when the pandemic hit, one of the things I was recognizing, because I went back and I actually followed 30 people during the pandemic as well, thinking, I'll do a pandemic dating article. And it became really clear to me for people who were ethically non-monogamous, they were already thinking about, okay, this is my polycule, so I can't see this person until we're done quarantining because they're immune compromised, or we have to keep this network closed because of lockdowns and all these other things. So people who were monogamous had never really thought about this in the way that I think poly people had already been. I had a particular participant in my study sent me his polycule map and how they had revised it based on households to deal with COVID pods. And it was a diagram that they already had put together just to try to manage STI testing amongst the group because some people were fluid bonded in the polycule. And I went, oh my God, like this is so obvious. So what can we learn from, poly people around managing networks of people around disease, right? And what we already know. And I forget how I got there.
Well, I have more questions, but I feel like I've been hogging you a little bit. Alex, where did you want to go?
Okay, two questions. One, what is the name of your book that you've been talking about?
Well,
so people can...
it's loosely titled because it's not done yet.
Oh, okay, it's not done.
So
okay.
it's right now it's going to be an academic book, but it's like design and online dating, like design, discourse, normativity, and post-digital intimacies. That's the title right now. And of course there'll be a colon. There will be a colon. It's an academic title. So I'm finishing that up
We're
right
going to
now.
put intimacies really big on the front, right?
Oh, I like that. I like that.
Okay.
Yeah. And
maybe like some heart eye emojis and like flame emojis.
Yeah.
Oh, I like it. And I think the other thing that's pretty important to that book is that normativities is what ended up becoming the center. So there's a chapter on gender identity for people who are non-conforming in terms of, non-binary, et cetera. There's a chapter on non-monogamous daters, and then there's a chapter on people I suggest are in the sexual borderlands, which is on that Kinsey scale, right? You're either heterosexual or homosexual or somewhere in the middle. And so everybody in the middle, right? That's not just lesbian, gay, but anybody who's bisexual, pansexual, heteroflexible, monogamish, like all these categories. I had about 47 people out of 115 that identified somewhere in that center. I am part of that center as well, by the way. Again, participant observer here. And so all of those groups deal with very specific things around online dating. And that's really where my book ended up going, was what does that mean if you're outside of the dominant mainstream, when you're out there.
Which you're saying nearly half of the people were.
Yeah, at least for I had there was 11 people who were gender nonconforming, so 10%, right, a little or 9%, and then I think it was 38. I got to remember my numbers, but it's around 38 to 40 were non-monogamous or had been at some point. So, which seemed it was almost half, but I know part of that is I did snowball methodology where people sent me people. So once I started getting more people in the non-monogamy community, I was like, oh no, I really want to get more representation here because it's an underrepresented area. So I don't know that that's a actual reflection, but there's been a lot of studies recently about the rise of non-monogamy, and younger people especially, like the percentage is much higher. And I put that in one of my articles that I wrote for The Conversation, and there was a whole Reddit discussion about whether or not the .gov survey that I cited was being accurate, and people were like parsing whether or not it's an overinflation. It was something like 30% of millennials or younger say they have a preference for non-monogamous relationship styles. And
okay, so speaking of Reddit discussions and your research, the results of that research, there are tons of people on Reddit forums related to non-monogamy asking for feedback on their dating profiles. And everybody wants to know, how do I construct a good dating profile? Especially, I think, people who are new to it. So what is your advice that you give? Let's
I'll give
spend
a
some
few
time
nuggets.
picking this apart.
I'll give a few nuggets, and I'll also say I'm planning to do some workshops around this, and obviously people can reach out if they have more specific things. I'd say the first thing is you have to have good pictures. I mean, pictures have the way that the apps have been set up now on our phones, they take up the majority of the real estate on your phone. They are the first thing people look at. They are the thing that will make people swipe no before they even read the profile. So, when I say good pictures, what I mean is they should be clear. If they're super blurry, if they look like it was something you photocopied from your 1975 yearbook, it's a problem.
They should be high quality. They should be recent.
They should be recent. If you're a person who has a lot of different looks, especially people who are queer who may be feminine presenting one day and masculine presenting another day, show both of those looks so people get a sense of who you are. Give people a sense of who you are in your life in context. So if all your images are selfies in your car, I have no context for who you are in your daily life. If you are a hiker, include a hiking picture out in the woods. Include a full body shot at some place so people get a sense of you from head to toe. People seem to be very suspicious when it's only headshots, that you're hiding something. So whether you are or not, it's just kind of you're giving a range of images. And then also be aware of not having all obstructed images. So sunglasses, hats, goggles. Sure, if you're a skier, one picture with your goggles and your ski makes sense, but it shouldn't be your opening picture, and it definitely shouldn't be the majority of your pictures. So that's one of the things I'd say about images.
I also hear in there, tell a little bit of a story
Yes.
about your life with the photos that you
Yes.
include, because that allows people to kind of picture you as a whole interesting person, not just an assemblage of physical characteristics.
Yeah, correct. And I would say it's you're creating a story of who you are, but you're also, people are trying to imagine themselves being in your life with you somehow. Do I want to be hanging out in the places that you're hanging out? So if you spend all your days at the local pub and those are all your pictures, I might be like, yeah, I kind of want to go for a walk every now and then, right? So there is something about kind of creating a narrative. I also like to think about your pictures as evidence for what you're saying. So what is in your bio, you can see your images as a way to kind of reflect who you're saying you are in a different way. You can also add captions on some of the apps to your images, which can be fun, and it can be helpful to people, especially if you're trying to like give them extra information about something that seems like an odd photo. The other thing is your bio. Depending on the app you're on, depends on how much space you have, right? If you're on Tinder, very limited bio. If you're on OkCupid, you can write a novella, for example. So, and then
many people do.
Yes, they do.
I mean, I have to say, as someone who also has been a professional writer and I was a columnist with a very strict word count for many, many years, what is your advice for people on like length? If you have all the space in the world, should you take it?
No, you should not take it. And I will say, I've also had to control myself because I also am a writer and I tend to write too much. I tell people to be really mindful of the fact that once it starts to feel too long, it probably is. And I think the hard part is people don't always know that about their own profile. So I encourage you to share it with somebody. If you're poly, share it with another partner and ask them. What I found really interesting is people who are poly, their other partners often give them the best advice. And they say, get rid of that picture. There's a better picture of you. You know, why didn't you say you're adventurous? You're totally adventurous. Like that's part of who you are. And not too long when it asks like, if you use the prompt, what are your favorite books? Don't list 50 books.
The rule of threes. I think of like these really standard writing tips that you probably give your students. It's like curiosity gap.
Right.
You don't want to write too much because you want people to still have things they want to know about you. And if you're giving examples, you only ever need 3.
And I would even say, I don't think it's a great idea to give explicit examples of which books and which music. I think it's better to say, you know, I love everything from jazz to country, but I don't really like metal, for example, because once you start naming things, people start going, oh, I hate that person, or they've been canceled. I'm not talking to them. Like, it's a weird thing that just, it gets too specific. And
the Swift divide.
Yes. And
it's real. We'll do an entire episode about
it. I would tell people, say like, I'm into this kind of stuff. What are you into? Ask people questions in your profile so they have a way to start a conversation with you. No.
Right. This brings up a question though for me about like, so we're both like communications people, and we always think about like service to your audience, right?
Yeah.
Which is probably good advice in this. Like, don't just think about yourself and how your profile makes you feel, but think about like who is the audience out there. Who's going to be reading it. But like, how do you balance that with being authentic, right? Because you're not trying to write a profile that is good. I feel like when I first went on dating apps, I was kind of trying to be like, how can I be good for everybody?
Right.
How can I like write the app that's going to please everyone to give me the most potential choice?
But you're not really trying to please everybody. You're trying to please the people who would be the best for you. Right. So, for example, if you are a writer and you read a lot, it makes sense that you might have a longer profile because guess what? One way to weed out people who aren't literary or don't like to read and don't like to talk about books is by having a profile that's longer than they want to read. As a side note, right? There's kind of a way to think about it in that way.
Or if I love metal,
right,
and I want to go to 3 metal shows a week, then, you know, and you say you don't like metal, that's great, Ricky. We're not going out, you know.
I want you to know that about me, right? Like I want when you think about what you're putting out there, think about putting out there what it is you like to do and what you'd like to do with other people. So being able to say something in your profile, and how do you make it interesting, right? There's lots of advice out there about prompts. Like you can say things like, you know, my mom describes me this way and my friend describes me this way, right? That could be an interesting opening. But I think at the core is to kind of recognize, here's who I am, here's what I'm looking for, here's how I like to spend my time, right? Here's some quirky things about me. Who are you? I'd like let's get to know each other. I think people can. I don't find myself to be especially creative and witty in a fun way on profiles, but when I see them in other people's profiles, I love them, and then I wish I was more like that. And I may be a writer, but I don't think I've seen profiles I think just blow mine out of the water in a heartbeat. And
I have a question about a kind of controversial weeding out of folks on dating apps, and I wonder if it's come up for you, and that's naming your politics. So one of the first experiences I think I had on dating apps was not to be forward facing with my more radical politics. And I ended up in conversation with, and sometimes on dates with, people who had like really profoundly different political values than I did. And so I changed that pretty early on.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, how have you encountered that? Do you notice trends in that? What advice do you have around that? That
became far more noticeable during the pandemic as people's politics became very much tied to the pandemic and like masking and vaccines. Also, it started showing up around the Trump election. Where people really started writing things like, oh, if you voted for Trump, swipe left, or, no MAGA people, especially people on the left. And then same, there wasn't as much coming from the right. I wasn't seeing it the same extreme. But definitely what I noticed in interviewing people is there were lots of people who said things like, I may agree with your politics, but if you write in your profile, if you did this, swipe left, I'm going to swipe left on you. Also, I don't want to go out with you because I think you're closed-minded. So there was a lot of people who and I don't think it was just about the politics. What it was is you're using a negative, you're starting with a negative. If you're this kind of person, I don't want to deal with you. Versus if you were to say something in your app that said, I love to talk about politics, I lean left. If we're not going to agree, we may end up, like saying something more like, I like to talk about politics. It matters to me. And I'm interested in, this is my politics. You're more likely to have somebody go, oh, great, cool. I'm on the same page. Let's do it. Or a person who's on the opposite side be like, oh yeah, I don't want to deal with that person because I don't want to talk about politics all the time.
For example, like earlier on, I might have said something like no Trumpers.
Right.
Now I'm more likely to say something like anti-capitalist, like feminist, revolutionary babe here, peace sign.
Yeah, that's more likely to get people. It's. I guess the other thing I would say, and this goes to Alex, your question earlier, like what makes for a good profile, being positive instead of. We all have our grumpy sides, and there's parts of us that are going to show up once we're in relationship, but you don't need to start with, I'm an angry, grumpy person, because nobody wants to meet up with there is something about you are putting your best foot forward. And we all know that. Like, so this question of authenticity, it's just like, I'd say it's like a job app. Like you're still putting your best foot forward. We all know that we're all doing that. And we all know we're going to find out each other's stuff as we get to know each other.
Yeah. Okay, so what about drilling down on like the poly-specific stuff? Like, I guess one question is, how much lingo do people put in? People put in?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great question. It's funny when you were just talking about weeding out around politics. I was going to say the other place where I see people doing weeding out is around how people talk about poly on their bios. As the trend of poly becoming more mainstream, and it truly is. We're seeing that. We're seeing that at least in a number of Western society. We're seeing it in the UK, we're seeing it here, we're seeing it in Australia. Those are 3 countries where I definitely am seeing it more in the media as well. And as that becomes more mainstream, what we have is more newbies, right? People who are like, oh, maybe I'm open to this. So one of the things is, how do you write about it in your profile? I am definitely of the opinion that you should be pretty explicit up front in your profile about what's your relationship style, partly because poly people are already trying to manage saturation, right? We don't want to hit polysaturation, but we're technically lifelong daters, right? Although we may take breaks and that sort of thing. But as people who are lifelong daters, we're always trying to manage, and nobody wants to waste their own time or other people's time. And so I think if for example, you prefer a hierarchical style, and somebody who's solo poly doesn't want to be in a relationship with someone who's hierarchical, put that out front. That helps you make decisions, right? I consider myself more a relationship anarchist, or I like relationship autonomist. I heard that on another podcast, to be clear. I didn't make it up, but I love that term.
Yeah, we got to have you back to talk about all that stuff.
Yeah.
We've been meaning to do a
Yeah.
what does relationship anarchy even mean? episode,
Yeah,
but anyway,
because
that would be
autonomy,
exciting.
right, is more,
Yeah.
it's not about the metaphors of blowing things up, which I think is not very positive for relationships, but autonomy, right, is about agency and trying to understand that everybody's kind
Good
of...
for politics, bad for relationships.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, blowing things up can have, well,
You did say you're a revolutionary piece, so maybe you like to be an anarchist.
Yeah.
But I think this is where I'm maybe a little more moderate about things. And I think as a metaphor person, like I really want, and I'm a linguist, right? The words matter. But I think it also creates a good conversation starter. It says in my profile, like, and by the way, I prefer this term. So I've actually had people like that comment on my OkCupid to go, oh, I've been thinking about this term a lot, right? So it's a good conversation starter.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is you want to know what you're looking for in non-monogamy, and you want to be able to clearly communicate that to people.
Yep.
But I also heard you say there's a lot of new folks out there, so there's some tension between how...
And I feel like in profiles where, especially like on Field, where people use a lot of lingo, about half the time they have a lot of experience and are being really precise about what they want,
Yeah.
and then the other half the time they're people who are really new to it who are signaling, who are trying to signal that they belong.
Right.
And then you're like, I don't understand what you mean because you don't understand what you mean.
And there's a lot who are just saying like, I'm new to this, right?
Right,
Like
which is great,
I'm new to this and I'm trying it out. Or they're using the labels, like Field lets you hit those label buttons, right? For poly, couples, singles, like there's, those label identifiers. And then there's, what did you write in your profile? Like I had somebody recently say to me, if they write that they are ethically non-monogamous versus poly, I swipe no on them because I think they're new. But that might not be the case. They may be somebody who, in my opinion, they could be somebody, and I definitely have a lot of these in my research, who say that they swing between swinging and poly. Like it depends on their situation or it depends on people. So I think, on the other hand, I would also say is we also do not have stable definitions within, like, do you say consensual non-monogamy? Do you write E&M? Do you write C&M?
As a linguist, and Jessica could probably weigh in on this because I think you introduced me to the term of pejoration, the idea that when something is already marginalized an identity, any term that is used to describe it will eventually go through the process of becoming pejorative, and then you'll come up with another term and it'll go through that process again. And I feel like you can watch that happen with non-monogamy. I call myself non-monogamous because it feels like the broadest,
me too,
most just like specifically descriptive term.
That's exactly.
It's both broad and specific in this way.
Yeah.
And I think when we're talking about that tension between signaling that you have some experience or you know what you're looking for and you're communicating that, and just barraging people with terms that kind of feel intimidating and also confusing. I don't know. It's hard to know.
Can I ask, since you're here, like how do you define those terms?
Well, I will say that ethical non-monogamy and consensual non-monogamy is getting used by people who are swinging and poly. But people who are poly and not swinging are very specific about saying they're poly and that they're not swinging. And they often will say, I'm poly or polyamorous.
Which would mean?
There's definitely, I will say, swinging often gets marginalized by a lot of people in the poly community as somehow it's more deviant and not as cool because it's not emotional. And I've definitely had that. I've heard that in interview data where a lot of people who are swinging don't care one way or another. They're more just, they're using a different, they'll talk about the lifestyle. They'll say we're in the lifestyle. They'll more often say they're in the lifestyle than swinging.
And you would define swinging as people who are in a couple having sex with other people, either together or perhaps
or apart,
but
the key difference with swinging is that with swinging, it's a hierarchical couple, and the whole no falling in love is usually part of that rule. It's emotionally exclusive between those two people. Everybody else is, although there's lots of swingers who have very close emotional relationships or closed network swinging networks, but there's definitely a hierarchy that protects the couple.
Do you think that's a a classed or like educational level definition? Because I remember at the end of last season we looked into a bunch of research and we were like finding that there's not very much that you've probably seen. I think it's like the Kinsey Institute research around that there's not much variation between the like rates of polyamory and non-monogamy or whatever you call it, like geographically and between political orientation. And what I drew from that was that there are a lot of people in the middle of the country and more conservative places who are probably swinging, right? But maybe they're like actually kind of doing similar things to the people on the coast, and they're calling it different stuff, and they're treating it differently. But it's maybe less about what they're doing and more about what they're calling it because of like culture and stuff.
And access points, like where people meet and how they meet. I think if we think about the Pacific Northwest as kind of ground zero for a lot of the poly community, there's poly community, and there's not as much community in parts of the Midwest, for example. So how do other people who are poly and or swinging, often they're finding each other through FetLife, Munches, or through sex clubs, which still tend to be very on the down low. And I think I would say that in many ways, hierarchical poly has a lot of similarities to swinging, in that it's still about maintaining that primary partnerships kind of priority, right? But there's lots of people who would say that they're hierarchical poly who may have other relationships that may not necessarily be as sexually focused, or not focused in kind of the friends with benefits kind of like, and also more often poly hierarchical couples are likely to be dating separately, not just going together.
Right.
There's something, I mean, because swinging is not wife swapping always necessarily, or as it used to be called, right? Like it goes both ways, but there's definitely some differences, I think, around, it's mostly, I think, about how people are finding each other, truly.
I think that's fascinating, and I am really grateful to be able to take a moment to bust this apart, because it is something that has kind of bothered me for a long time. The terminology feels confusing, and not, even though there's a lot of it, like somehow not actually satisfyingly descriptive or clear. And especially that differentiation between polyamory and swinging non-monogamy, consensual non-monogamy, which does not actually feel like the bright line that people sometimes describe it as. And just anecdotally in my own life and with folks that I date, something more along the lines of hierarchical polyamory sounds more descriptive of what most people I know who are married or have young families are practicing. And I think I'm feeling a little personally defensive, and have in the past, with being told that it's not polyamory, you know, because there's like this kind of centering of the couple in a hierarchical way. But most of the people that we know, they do have like loving relationships that go on for long periods of time, and there isn't a restriction against emotions.
Right. Those are caring relationships, and they're not necessarily sex-forward relationships.
And they're not totally defined by sex, or, you know, so.
Yeah. I mean, another difference maybe is like how present like the patriarchy is, right? Like just the idea of like wife swapping or like that kind of terminology would probably never show up, like, or would show up differently in like this context.
Well,
right?
and another thing I think that fits with kind of what are the challenges for different people. And I think, Sarah, I know you were saying you had kind of a question earlier about how does this work for different groups of people in terms of online dating. And I would say one of the things that is very clear around for men that identify as bisexual, pansexual, in the swinger community, they're much more in the closet about that, because the swinger community or the lifestyle tends to still be much more, there's the perception that like every woman in the lifestyle is bi, but men are not. And that's not true. But what I've discovered is how many men who are really bi are signaling it in different ways or asking about it pretty early, but they don't actually write on their profile that they're bi. And usually the option on the lifestyle dating sites, the option is basically straight or bi. It's not pan. It doesn't have a bunch of other options. So we can even see how the architecture of the apps, are they more progressively providing other identities for sexuality and gender? And they tend not to be. So in the swing community, that becomes a less safe space, I think, for men that are bi, because it's no swords crossing is the concept I've heard quite often. And there's a lot of that toxic masculinity or, fear of being gay. Oh my God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that is experienced, which I don't see as much for people who identify as poly.
Interesting. It's almost as though polyamory and queerness have a really explicit relationship with each other.
And what's interesting too, and you probably have all experienced this to some extent, except our resident monogamist, Jessica. But there is a lot of people who are poly and bi will just identify as queer, right? Which is that's how I identify, because it encapsulates, right? My sexuality is, out there. My sexual relationship style and my sexuality are both kind of in this multi space. But there's a lot of people in the LGBT community who are not okay with poly people putting themselves under the LGBT umbrella. And there's lots of gay and lesbian people who think that you've talked about bi invisibility, I think, on your podcast before, right? Like pick a side, or, you haven't decided, you're just in the closet, you haven't made a decision, or, and then there's also people who are like, you get to hide out with hetero privilege when you're with an opposite sex partner. So politically you're not out front all the time. And, all the work that has been done in the queer community for rights, you as a bi person get to kind of hide out and you get to pass.
You don't have the same cred or experience.
Right.
If we were going back to advice on dating apps based on the kind of areas that we've explored, how much information do you think is the right amount of information to put out there about your identities, your sexuality, your orientation, the way you are practicing polyamory? I will make an admission that probably is I'm not that proud of, but sometimes when I see dating apps and it's just paragraphs of those kinds of descriptors, I just bounce off of them. Yeah. It's I feel like I just don't even know what to do with it.
Yeah, because you feel like you're going to be told that you're doing it wrong or something.
I think it does make me feel that way a little bit, and that's what I'm maybe not proud of, but I thought I'd see what you had to say about that.
Well, I think one thing to think about is which platform are you on, right? Because some platforms give you a lot of labels and tags that you can pick from, and that just kind of solves that, right? Do you pick, actually it's funny because OkCupid allows you to pick 5 things at a time. So do you pick all 5? Do you say, I pick bisexual and pansexual because I'm over 50, so a lot of people I might be dating, especially if they're 10 years older than me, might not understand the terminology yet of pansexual. But even though I have a problem with bi and how it creates the binary, I recognize that my audience, this goes to the earlier, recognizing your audience, I need to be able to kind of encapsulate. I think having loads of lists is not necessarily super productive, but I think this is the whole change your profile kind of regularly. I mean, one of the ways you can also mess with the algorithms of the apps to kind of continue to bring you up is to make changes to your profile, change a couple of photos, change a couple of lines in your in what you've written. One of the ways is you can just kind of figure out what your descriptor is. So for me, I do say I have a long-term partner and I'm open, some comments here and there. I try to find a sentence, right? Who's in my life, and to let you know I do have a person. I even went back and forth. Do I write non-nesting? Again, I'm starting to use the internal language.
We're going to have a lingo demystification section of this episode for sure.
Right. But do you want to write all the stuff? I think getting clear to say, all right, I'm I haven't written that I'm kitchen table, but I realize maybe I should or maybe not. I think I'm always going back and forth. My answer to your question clearly is not very helpful because what I'm saying is it is, as the language is changing and as more and more people are kind of coming into the polyverse and the non-monogamy verse, I think I try to figure out how to not use too much lingo, but to use enough lingo.
Yeah, I think
Right.
paired with your advice before about framing things positively rather than negatively, it is really
Yes.
helpful because,
Yeah.
like, I think what I was referencing before is when people are like, here's who I am and how that
Manifest.
informs what I don't want.
Right.
Then that really sounds a certain way. But if you're like, here's who's in my life, here's what I'm doing, and here's like what I'm open to,
Right.
what I'm looking for, then I
Right.
think that does sound welcoming usually, and is not usually a thing that I bounce off of.
Yeah. You can definitely, people do signal hurt and pain through
Yeah.
their profiles sometimes.
Well,
and
yeah.
like when people will be very specific about like not looking for fill in the blank. And I think the therapist in me is like, ooh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's probably what
You're like,
happened
are you looking
most
for
recently.
a therapist?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I think the one thing I also did discover in my research too is within every polycule and swinger relationship, most people don't have the exact same style as their partners. They're always a little bit of a difference. Like, so, for example, this one couple who at first thought they were swingers, it became very clear he's poly and she's a swinger. He's been poly since he was a teenager. He's always had a couple relationships. He's always the one who keeps in touch with their swinger partners, like to check in, to see how, like, he maintains friendship with those people in a way that's very poly. And through that interview, they both went, oh, wow, we didn't realize that even they were different, even though they thought they'd been together for years, they'd been swinging together, but it helped them kind of think about
Yeah.
that differently.
It seems like a service that you could offer as well, like just helping people with the taxonomy.
Yeah, what's your
of their
taxonomy?
relationship.
Yeah, but even like what people want, they tend to be like, so I think if you recognize that, it's much more helpful when you put out into the world, here's my general style, or here's what it looks like in my world right now, and here's what I have room for, maybe. Although
I like that.
and this is why changing your profile regularly changes. I realized a month ago, like, damn it, I'm polysaturated already. Because I started dating like crazy because I did the whole like, oh, I'm out there again. And then I got a lot of messages, and then I was managing too many people, and I went, damn it.
Well,
So
yeah, and I think that speaks to like it's probably too broadly generalizing to say that this is like the male and female experience on apps, but there's definitely like moments or like experiences. The one is like trying to filter and like having your profile be trying to like filter out too much to like get what you want, and then there's the experience of trying to just like get a response, right? And like, so the one conundrum is like, I'm barraged with like way too much, and how do I find like, and that I'm sure from what I've heard that can be an overwhelming and sometimes like alienating experience. Like, I'm not interested in any of these people. And then the other experience is like, I feel like sort of tacitly rejected by just not really getting a lot of connection at all.
yeah. And this is definitely a difference that we see around gender and sexual orientation for sure, and gender identity. Like, women tend to get a lot more traffic. Part of that is men more often, the tradition of men being the one to reach out, they still do, unless they're on Bumble, right? Where women have to make the first move. But because men traditionally write first, women are dealing with fielding. I like to think of it as women are on defense and men are playing offense, which is kind of in a hetero kind of situation. And they also do it differently, right? So men will say like, I don't get so many, likes, or I'm not getting matches. What's the problem? And I think there's another thing, which is around user practices are different. So more often men do the power swiping where they're just like, okay, I'm just going to say yes to everybody and then see who likes me. And then I'll go back and read their profile. Women often do the opposite, or women identifying people, where they are looking at pictures. They may decide by picture, but then they'll read profiles, but they're not going to match as often without reading first. And I think, and this is also the same for people who are gender nonconforming, and especially for trans people. And I think it's a safety issue from everything I've heard that, and as a woman, I would say the same, like, I'm trying to keep myself safe. And definitely I hear this from trans folks that they're reading very carefully in a profile before they match with someone, because we don't want to be overpowered by a person who's either trying to hurt us or is bigger than us and all that kind of thing. So the practices are different, which explains why this mismatch happens a lot.
And I think even just like emotional safety, that you can have the experience of people being cruel to you online. Most women, trans people, and queer people really have had that experience outside of dating apps. I was a woman writer online for many years, so like I'm pretty well versed in that experience too. So I don't, just the idea of going in and having some random exchanges with dudes online, literally nothing about that is appealing to me. And I make the joke sometimes that I think comes from your dad, from Fishermen Up in Alaska, about you may get a lot of matches if you're a woman, but, and you know, what do they say? The odds are
good, but the
goods are odd, right? You know, it's like, it's a lot of numbers, and it doesn't really translate into anything that feels like positive or exciting.
Yeah, and I think that can be like a sort of snowball effect, or like a vicious cycle, because then on the other side of that, I think men are getting, and probably our next guest, actually next time we'll be able to speak to this more, are getting, you know, it's not a heartening experience to like feel sort of pre-rejected a lot, or just like being out there, like being as vulnerable as men are used to being, which is maybe not that vulnerable, and then like, you know, just not getting a lot of responses. And then when you do, sometimes the people sort of like disappearing, and then sometimes you like move sort of further back into your shell and just being like, well, I'm not going to say, you know, I said a nice thing to a bunch of women when I first got on the app, and then it didn't work out. So now I'm just like trying to just like, you know, you can see how that just recedes into more sort of cynicism and more kind of, and eventually you arrive at some sort of place that is,
can be misogynistic.
Yeah, it can be misogynistic. And I think that's like what a lot of the people who sort of study this have, where they've sort of ended up.
Well, there's been also, I mean, there's quite a bit of research too on this about how much harassment and, you know, sexual harassment and just abusive verbal behavior that women experience on dating apps. There was a recent Pew Research study. Every year they have, they are looking at some of this stuff, and it was interesting. The women under 50, the percentage was over like 60 or 70% have experienced this. I'm 52. I've definitely experienced it. And it's funny. I think to myself sometimes, I want to respond. Somebody's written me a nice intro and I want to say, hey, that's really cool. I don't think we're going to match, but thanks for reaching out, or I really like this about yours. And I'm in the back of my head, I'm thinking, if I even respond at all, do I now have to deal with this game where the person's trying to still trying to sell me and convince me, and then I'm now putting all this emotional labor and time where I really was just trying to not make them feel like crap when they reached out, and let them know we're not or to be told, oh, you're a bitch, which is what a lot of women have experienced when they write back, even just with a kind word. And
literally last week, a global information study that I will look up and put in the show notes came out and determined that women are the most harassed demographic of people online, and that the majority of women have experienced some sort of hate speech online.
Yeah,
it's just like a really unpleasant place to be.
Right.
Which I think leads me into like a big line of questioning that I had here as a therapist, and a therapist who works with young people, queer communities, and polyamorous, non-monogamous communities. I end up talking to people about the dating apps a fair amount. And of course, the context is therapy, so they're not coming in and being like, had a great experience on the dating apps. But I will say that it just causes so much anxiety, despondency, compulsion. There's a lot of like negative mental health intersections with the dating apps. And of course, like we know social media has that impact, and that's been like pretty well researched and documented at this point. But I wanted to ask you about that. Like, what do you encounter in your work? What advice do you have for people? You know, if I'm just being disclosing something personal about myself, I never want to go on the dating apps. Like, I have to, I'll tell Alex, I'm going to get my blood up to go on the dating apps for 20 minutes. And I'm just like, ugh, it's only been 15. Okay.
Right.
You know, it makes me so depressed and anxious.
Yeah.
Like, it is not a fun place for me.
Even when you have a hype man over here, like, yes.
Which I really do. It's great.
Well, I think you're talking about two things that are super important to this, which is we know there's the whole dopamine hit in the brain, the feel good of being liked. We know the gamification of swiping apps. There's enough studies that have shown, which are just like other social media types of sources, and that we get hooked, right? That we get addicted. And so first thing I'd say is timing, right? Like, limit yourself. Recognize, like, put it in your calendar. Like, all right, I'm going to look at my thing, for 30 minutes or whatever. Give yourself kind of limits if you can. I think the other thing, and this really relates to the poly dating especially, is what becomes really difficult is, say you do go on for an hour and you decided to buy the premium. I'm going to throw this out because this is one of the other things about decisions about how to use apps. If you're poly, for example, some apps, you can use the filtering options around deal breakers. Like OkCupid, if you have premium, you can say, I only want to see people, right, who are non-monogamous. But if you have the free version, then you're going to see other people, right? You don't get to limit things as much, which means you really are going through your own filtering and you're spending a lot more time swiping. If you're paying premium, you may be looking at who likes you because you can see who likes you. But if you're online dating forever because you're poly, that's pretty expensive. And a lot of people may not be able to afford that. It's not accessible. So there's all these kinds of things to be thinking about. If you are, like, you're on the app, say Monday, and you've swiped and there's like even 2 people who you thought were interesting and you sent a hello to or liked and they liked you back, you may now be starting to juggle just 2 people that week. And maybe you really only have 1 day a week that you're free to go date. So now you're doing the whole thing where you're messaging and you're trying to, like, well, I have time in 2 months, right? So one of the things about being poly, I think that becomes another issue is you're already dealing with the crazy calendar, right, of if you have other people in your world. And once you are managing multiple people, then you're also managing multiple dates. So if I was to think about the mistakes that I've made, because that's your podcast, I was thinking about that today. Probably my biggest mistake when I went back out there was I did not slow myself down on, okay, I've matched with 2 people. I should just back away from the phone and see where those go, because then I was also juggling too many dates. And my own advice that I did not take, that I give to lots of people, which is utilize video chat. People learned how to use Zoom and video chat during the pandemic. If you live out in the sticks or Tacoma like I do, and half of the poly world is in Seattle, for example, driving becomes a time suck, and trying to find the day that works when you can go, when traffic's not crazy, whatever, So I think I would have been better had I followed my own advice and said, let's do our first date as a video date so I'm not feeling overwhelmed by the fact that I now have a bunch of dates. And by the way, don't have the money to go out on a bunch of dates where there's coffee
to buy a $15
or drinks
cocktail or whatever,
dinner. Yeah. And I don't assume the guy is going to pay. And I don't really want somebody I don't know to, like, all of a sudden be saying, oh, well, I paid, you owe me something. So,
Riki, have you noticed the increase in popularity of speed dating? I've been thinking about, especially like in queer poly communities, it seems like I've seen more of those events cropping up. Do you think that that's in part in response to some of this angst or exhaustion that people experience in online dating? And
coming out of the pandemic, too. I think it's like, how do we get back into real life? But I do think there are movements, meetup groups, right? More in-person stuff. What I would also say that's interesting, and I think when we were talking about my crazy long book title that includes post-digital is really about meaning that technology is so integrated that we're kind of we're wired and in person at the same time, so that I may be at a speed dating event, but before I leave, maybe I've, shared some stuff on my phone. Maybe I've, people are cruising in bars and looking at their app to see who's geolocated within a mile, right? Those are kind of, I think, part of how those work together. But I do see there has been a rise in speed dating. And I went to a speed dating event recently in the area. And it was a queer speed dating event. And I realized the first thing I had to tell everybody was, okay, here's some possible deal breakers for you. I live in Tacoma, right? I had to put out the geography because people...
You should have just worn a shirt that was Tacoma Pride.
I live in Tacoma, so if that's a deal breaker. But also to tell people I'm bi because it was queer. So there's also lesbian women who don't want to be with women who are bi. And also I have a male partner in my life and a lot of lesbian women who might not be okay with that either. Or the fact that I have another partner in my life. So I think it was funny to be in an event it wasn't dedicated to poly, it was dedicated to queerness, but I recognize there are things that are deal breakers for people that it's almost like I would have put it on my profile, right?
The apps would have facilitated that filtering and you had to do it, in person. But then there's a bunch of other filtering that the apps wouldn't facilitate, just like vibes that show up in person and the way that you carry yourself and like those first few minutes of conversation that, are going to take all of this work to do on the apps through the swiping and text chats and stuff like that, the stuff that you wouldn't get to until you did that video chat or whatever it was.
Well, and I think one of the things about, this is related and unrelated, but like OkCupid has now added the label of, right, non-monogamous, monogamous, and open to non-monogamy. And if you have the free service, for example, you're going to get both of those. You can't filter it out. But I've also been hearing a lot of people talking about when people say they're open to non-monogamy, a lot of people who have been poly for a while, that to them is a signal of like, you're not really
I don't fuck with
poly.
Yeah, Alex has a strong opinion about this, actually.
Tell us your opinion.
Oh, just that I don't really mess with that.
Do you have a rule? Like, I've heard people say like, you have to be poly for a year. I don't want to be your training wheels. These are kind of things I've heard.
I would not say I'm great with rules like that. I've definitely dated a lot of people where I kind of liked not a lot of people, but where I kind of liked the idea that I was telling them about it.
Yeah. You got to be the educational.
But yeah, I think for some reason that one in particular is like a signal, is like not really a thing that I love. So I would rather the person be like just doesn't say anything about it, like on other apps.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is that
it's
label
completely illogical?
I feel like you maybe had a bad experience with
I don't know. I think it's just the sort of waffling that where they're just like, I'm like, whatever.
So here's what I've thought about this recently. And I have a chapter on the whole non-monogamy and labeling. So open to non-monogamy is the label that OkCupid created. It is not the label that the person has created.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about the fact that as a reader of somebody's profile, I just see it as their descriptor, not the platform's descriptor. So what I have found myself doing now is, because somebody did reach out to me and I saw they had that. And so I went back through their profile and I did the sleuthing that I think many poly people do, which is, are they really open to poly? And I think about, I had somebody in my research who had said way back when that what they looked for were things like language that was all about an exclusive relationship. Did they talk about, I'm looking for a partner? Am I looking for a soulmate? Am I looking for like
my person?
Singularity.
Yeah.
So they looked for people who said things like partners or people, and they looked for plurality in the profile as a real indicator, and they did the same in theirs. And so I actually responded to somebody and said, just to be clear, you said you're open, but in looking at your profile, everything here suggests you're really monogamous, which to me says if we got involved and you met somebody, you're going to dump me and move on. And that's not how I operate. So I don't see a future here.
Or they're trying to pull somebody into monogamy, but they're kind of like open to
the cowboy, cowgirl thing.
Yeah, exactly.
For our terminology.
Yeah, and I think the people that I was referring to was like more people who I met on Hinge outside of there being a lot of that context. And it was very clear on my Hinge profile that I was poly, and then they liked me on Hinge, and then it was revealed that like they were coming out of a monogamous relationship and were open to it in a way that they were like actually curious.
Yeah.
And that's what had attracted them to me.
Yeah.
And then we more ended up being like friends, and like they asked me a bunch of questions about it.
Yeah.
And like it's not like we had big relationships,
Right.
but I kind of like helped them like learn about what was going on with it, and then whatever.
Well, and I think
They
based
went
on
other way.
profiles, right, which platforms, like
Yeah.
Hinge is another mainstream platform that has added the option for non-monogamy. So now at this point, OkCupid had it first for mainstream apps, right? Tinder has the option on the label, and Hinge has it on the label as well. But in my experience on Hinge, it's not actually, you can't filter for it at all. I decided it's too.
Yeah.
I'm spending way too much time just going through people who, and they don't even have to put if they're monogamous or non-monogamous. So to me, it's not useful as a poly person to use it. Tinder is different in that it's already so sex forward that people tend to give enough information. But again, I find that a frustrating experience. So I pretty much have found like Field and OkCupid to be the most poly friendly, at least in this part of the world or country, because apps are also regional. So there's that.
Yeah, that was going to be kind of a closing question that I was going to ask you is what do you think
Yeah.
are the best? And I think the OkCupid one is strange. That's been my experience too, that I think I've met the most people that I actually had relationships with on OkCupid. And I think if you ask the Gen Pop, like monogamous people, what are the best dating apps? OkCupid is like
Yeah, it's low.
distant, like it's kind of considered to be this weird old
Right.
app that nobody really uses anymore, but it really works for
Well, and I did a talk with the Evergreen Hearts lecture series last month, which for people in the Seattle area, I highly recommend you check them out. They're evergreenhearts.org. They pretty new in the last year. They're creating lots of resources and lecture series and trying to help people connect. And I did a poll in, just the audience, like what apps are you using? And it was a poly online dating talk. And pretty much it was Field and OkCupid were what people raised their hands as their primary apps, at least to use here. And I think part of it is because the way the affordances of the app, the way the labeling and the filtering work, it's the most friendly to help you really find that. And you're going to find people going there because they know it's the most, it's basically the poly bar. Like if we talk about dating apps or platforms as bars, like that's the queer bar, that's the gay bar, that's the poly bar. Like to me right now, OkCupid and Field are kind of the poly bar, although Field is the non-monogamy bar in general, because it's also I'd say there's a lot of people who are also swingers that are also on there, and they can create couple profiles with the linked option. OkCupid used to let people link, and they just stopped doing that this year.
Oh, really?
Seems like Field is also kind of the kink bar.
And also the kink bar, yeah.
And
for
also
sure.
the poly-curious, I'm going to make a profile and then delete it.
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything, right? And
I like it because of that. I like it because
Yeah,
it
it's
seems
chaotic.
kind of chaotic. I was going to say that's my favorite one. And when I've just like ended my subscriptions on all the other ones, I tend to keep that one because I'm just like, I'll eat popcorn and watch that one.
well, I've met very cool people on both.
Same, yeah.
And I still have people in my world that I met through both. So there's quality people out there, but I think part of it is there's also it is a little chaotic. It is definitely the most, I'd say, sex positive in that way, in that it's kind of around relationships and different sexual.
It seems like sex assertive.
Yeah,
sometimes.
sometimes, but not for everybody, right? Depends on what you're looking for. There is #open, but I'm finding that not many people have been using it. A number of years ago, before the pandemic, at what is it? The Hump Festival, right? Dan Savage's dirty little porn festival. That's what he calls it. Which for people who are listening who are not in Seattle, that was a Pacific Northwest thing. Although it's now all over the country. They started advertising #open as a new app before the pandemic, and I think a lot of people got on it, but then there wasn't enough tipping point. But it allowed people to do joint profiles, separate profiles, and it was very much about kind of everything. It was poly, it was everything. But I mean, #open is still out there, and if you go to their website, it's the people who are promoting it, like, Tristan Taramino is one of the, like, this is the greatest place, but I've not found that people are using it much these days, and I'm not exactly sure why, but my my suspicion is based on it just didn't get enough tipping point of people. And for people who are outside of cities, big cities, geography is a big thing for dating apps. I mean, dating apps help you find people, but they also mean you have to travel. And for people in cities, they can find people more easily. Some apps allow you to change your location so you can find people in cities you go to. One of the things we have seen about dating apps in general is that people have started dating outside of their social world and much further, and also diversifying who they date. And I think it's partly because of this. And I think that is also what we're seeing with poly, is that people are like, oh, I can explore this. But at the same time, it's a whole new ballgame for a lot of people, and trying to figure that out as a person who's experienced in poly. Do you want to be the person to educate people? Do you know what's going to happen? Yeah.
It's funny, as I was listening to you talk about how geography and dating and how people used to meet each other and how we do now, I was thinking about how Alex and I watched When Harry Met Sally last night.
Oh, yeah.
And if you remember, in that movie, interspersed throughout, there are these elderly couples talking about how they met each other.
Right.
And it's all like, we were high school sweethearts. We grew up in the same tenement. Our parents arranged our marriage. It just really struck me, how different dating is now than it was then. And it was maybe a little bit of a reality check for me, because I hate the app so much, and I have sort of a complex emotional relationship with online spaces. I tend to romanticize the idea of meeting in person and the kinds of connections that you might find. And I remember as we were watching it, I'm like, yeah, you know what? There's something to complain about with dating culture,
right?
Whatever is happening.
And it's supposed to be 1980s commentary on 1950s, 40s and 50s couples, and then of course, here we are, 50 years later than when that movie was made.
In 30 years from now, someone will be romanticizing this experience.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, and if you think about the elderly people who were in Harry Met Sally, they have met their partner at a time where marriage wasn't about romantic love so much yet. Romantic love is a very recent phenomena, industrial age, post-industrial age. Then you add the feminist movement and women going into the workplace, and women actually having enough money to support themselves and not relying on a male partner. And now we have kind of a whole other world where it's hard to not have a double income, right, to get by. And so I think so much stuff has changed socially that has also affected these changes.
Yeah. And that's, I think, what that movie is about, now that I think about it.
It is.
They're peers, and it's about them being peers, and can they be peers and romantically involved and in love with each other.
And it
that's,
feels like
the
this very
struggle of the whole movie.
post second wave feminist commentary on what is the relationship between straight men, cis men.
We should do a bonus episode where we just analyze that movie.
And
it's really good. I was surprised at how great that movie
is. We stayed up until 1 in the morning watching it by accident.
I feel like I need to watch it again because I hadn't thought about it through that lens. But then add the fourth wave feminists, right? The whole technology and how technology is integrated into our life and how we deal with women being harassed. I mean, we have a whole other layer when we think about how dating apps have become part of intimacy these days.
Yeah. What would Nora Ephron do with poly, queer, dating, romantic comedy?
Right.
There's a episode, it's an anthology series that was on Netflix years ago called Easy. I don't know if you saw it.
I've heard that recommended to me before.
Yeah, and there's one storyline of a couple that decides to open up, and because he's all excited, but then she starts getting all the action, which is what often happens in couples, right? Women end up getting more attention when they get out there, and and then it was very interesting because it also became he actually fell for somebody. He gets emotions for somebody, and they really have to think about how does this work for us? And if I think about it, I think this was in 2017. So it's one of the earlier storylines that is bringing in poly. I think there was also in The L Word, there was a storyline where Phoebe is approached by a poly couple and they want her to join their triad, right?
Someone mentioned to me that in the reboot of Sex and the City, there's a character that they feel like is expected to kind of carry all the millennial and Gen Z identities. So they're poly, non-binary, just an online personality. So I think it is showing up there,
Yeah.
even if it's kind of like flat sometimes in its exploration.
I think as people who are experienced poly, I think one of the best things they can do for themselves on dating apps and for others is just be really clear, concise, clear around your language, what your style is, what you're looking for, what you have space for. And if you say things like, I have a nesting partner, you could write in parentheses, somebody I live with. Now you don't have to add that to your primer. Or if you write KTP, write in parentheses, kitchen table poly. I want my people to be a family that know each other, or whatever. Like, that's another way I think we can educate people that are coming into polyamory, because at the same time, I would hate to be the person to say, well, if nobody wants to deal with newbies, then we don't. I mean, poly is a very small dating pool as it is. Do you want more people out there or not, right? That's kind of one of the questions I would ask myself, and I've been asking myself. And I was we've all at one point been that new person. And so how do we compassionately make space for people who are new to it, but also learn to read if they're not there yet, and can they deal with where we're at? And how much emotional labor are we willing to give, and do we have in terms of bandwidth to help bring people on board? If somebody looks like they are somebody that you would really want to hang out with,
That's basically why we started this podcast.
Right.
So I know we're coming up on the end of our time for recording, but I wanted to give Jess a chance to weigh in with any reflections on monogamy versus non-monogamy in the online dating space, or just, if you want, term clarification.
I mean, I wrote down a lot of terms, and I don't know if we want to do maybe a little lightning round of I could just say a term, and then you guys give a quick definition.
I think we can let Riki do that.
Yeah.
I love this idea.
Okay.
I always worry that I'm going to say things and not define them, and later listen and go, wow, that was really excluding.
Well, okay. So I think there's three, sort of, that I think are defined against each other, but I'm not quite clear what the difference is. So E&M, poly, swinging.
Okay.
E&M.
E&M, ethical non-monogamy, which often gets conflated or used synonymously with CNM, consensual non-monogamy. And from what I found, nobody really agrees, except to say that everything's in the open, non-monogamous and in the open, not in the closet. Everybody involved knows, and it can include, to me, it's the umbrella term that everything fits under. So
Okay.
Swinging and poly would be styles underneath ethical, consensual non-monogamy. And polyamory would fit more in multiple loves and a space for emotional relationships. And that emotion is primary, where for swinging, sexual, let me put it this way. Poly would be not exclusive, unless you've got a hierarchical couple. I'm going to start getting messy here. But poly is about multiple emotional loves, whereas swinging is about multiple sexual partners.
Okay. Yes. Got it.
But swinging tends to be defined more around one couple that has an emotional bond, whether they're married or not. Often they're thought of as married, that also engage in extra curricular sexual activity together or with others.
Okay.
But it's more about the sex is the fun stuff. Nobody falls in love outside. Where poly, there's always room for emotional love and relationships to form. And it's kind of expected that that's what the goal is. And that sex may be a nice plus, but it's not sex first. It's more emotion first, I think, is how those two get put up against
Okay.
each other.
Okay. So how about KTP, or kitchen table poly?
Kitchen table poly would be you like to be able to sit around the kitchen table with your partner and your partner's partners, also known as metamors, and have a cup of coffee or have a meal. But many people would like to talk about being kitchen table and more of the polycule becomes a family. Everybody's invested in everybody's well-being. The opposite of kitchen table would be parallel poly, where people are dating other people, but they may not necessarily be crossover. Partners that don't really want to meet their partner's partners. Don't ask, don't tell also can fall under non-kitchen table. But a lot of people always wonder if that is really about cheating.
Okay, and then polycule.
Polycule is your network of poly people. So like, I have a long-term partner and my partner has another girlfriend. So I would say the three of us may be in a polycule, but then if I'm dating somebody else, all of those people are connected in a network where we've all probably talked about sexual transmitted infection. We've talked about STIs and testing to make sure everybody's safe and that they're on the same page around safer sex practices, et cetera. We may all hang out. Maybe they'll all meet each other. Maybe they won't, depending on how kitchen table.
Right. Okay. So conceivably, the entire Seattle metropolitan area could be one
gigantic polycule.
Or the whole universe.
on a long enough timeline.
And I did write an article in The Conversation, which is like really short, called "What is a Polycule," which I would recommend.
We'll link to that.
And part of that also talks about kind of different perceptions around hierarchy and non-hierarchy.
Let's see. Okay, and then there were three terms that came up, I think, when we were talking about sex parties, which it always comes back to sex parties.
Yeah.
Jessica's favorite.
Often were called key parties and house parties back in the day. They're still called house parties, but
Well, so I think that FetLife munches.
Munches.
The word? And
Yeah.
sex clubs, I think, all came up in the same. And I was like, what?
okay, sex parties or house parties is probably another term that gets used pretty regularly. In the 70s, they were called key parties because people dropped their keys in the basket kind of thing. But sex parties could be at a club or at a hotel. Often, if they're at hotels or clubs, it's because it's part of a sex club, and many big cities have one or two. Seattle has one. There's 2 and 3 in Portland that I can think of. Actually, there's 2 in Seattle. I take that back. So lots of big cities will have these clubs, and people have to have a membership, and there's certain nights it's open, and there's playrooms, and it's kind of like there's a bar and usually a bar and a dance floor where people meet, like a regular bar, but then there's also playrooms where people can go in the back and play together. Some are big open rooms where lots of people play, small rooms with curtains where you can have privacy if you're a newbie and you're kind of freaked out. So that's sex clubs. Sex parties are usually at somebody, or house parties are at someone's house, like maybe a network of people invite all their other people. And then what was the other one?
Munches.
Oh.
And FetLife.
FetLife is the social network for kinksters. That's what they call themselves. Many people in my study talked about using FetLife for online dating, but they weren't sure if it counted because it's not really an online dating platform. It really is like Facebook for the kink community. But you can direct message people, that you can be friends with people, and lots of people post events in the area. Munches are like social gatherings, say like there's a munch for the poly community or for the swinger community or the kink community. Somebody hosts it at the local bar and everybody goes, oh, there's a munch. It's a chance to meet people in the community, but it's not sexual. It's just social. It's like happy hour usually, or I went to one. Yeah, I went to one at a tea store recently. That was fascinating. It was great. I met some cool people.
Nice.
So it's a good way to network and also find out where other events are, right? So this is kind of part of the find your people, find your tribes, right?
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that was
Riki.
all my lightning round terms.
Cool.
Wow. There's so many questions left, but that just means we have to have you on again.
Okay.
There's more I'd love to talk about. Before we say goodbye, Riki, I know you had some shout outs and upcoming events that you wanted to get in. You've mentioned the dating workshops that are on offer in the coming year. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about those? Where can people find out more?
Yeah. So my website is rikithompson.com, RIKITHOMPSON.com. I am going to start hosting workshops, maximum 20 people, looking to do them in Tacoma and Seattle primarily, thinking depending on how much interest there is, I'll see how often I do them. I'd like to do one that's specifically poly-focused or non-monogamy focused, since I realize there's so many people who are needing help around this. And I definitely am appreciative that Evergreen Hearts has kind of come on and they've really created a great space. They have a listserv. I feel like I'm promoting them, but I think I am, because they're a nonprofit and they're really trying to take hold of providing resources and networking people. And they have a newsletter. So I realize more people are on that, the more that I can also share stuff that'll get shared. But also I'll post things about my workshops on my website. I also will be doing a talk probably in the spring series for Evergreen Hearts. I need to send my proposal in on Friday. I did a talk for them already, and I'm looking to kind of do part 2 of poly online dating around more like messaging and meeting rather than just setting up your profile and kind of the things that are happening there. I do want to shout out to my University of Washington. I got funding for my big project through them, and I'm really grateful. And also the people who shared their stories. I mean, I talked to over 100 people, many of whom are probably listeners to this podcast. So if you were in my study, thank you for sharing your experiences and your stories. This project wouldn't have happened without everybody. Do I have any others?
Well, if our listeners were interested in taking a workshop with you, how can they find out? And is there anything they should know?
Oh, yes. Well, check out my website. It will be under like talks and workshops, and I'll start posting dates of when I'm going to run them. But if you use mistakes as your discount code, you can get 20% off coming to your first workshop with me.
Cool.
Yeah.
What about us?
Maybe
You don't have to answer that.
pay
maybe
20%
50% off. Maybe I'll give you a special.
Riki, I think I learned a new term. Tell me, have you heard of dexting?
Tell me. I haven't.
I heard this yesterday, and I was so thrilled that there was a term for it. It's when you get into a chat relationship with someone that just goes on and on and on, and you never end up...
Because you're dating texting.
You're dating, texting, dexting.
Yes.
So I just had to throw that out there.
I love it.
because-
You know what I do love about research in general is I always am learning new things. And I thank you for sharing another term.
That's what we need, clearly.
Yes. I think you should be aware of that for yourself, too, if you're out there. How long are you willing to dext?
Yeah.
And do you really not want to dext?
Yeah.
And if you don't, when are you going to say, hey, let's have a video chat or a
Right.
meetup?
Also, the sex to dext pipeline is real.
Sex
Sometimes if
to
you
dext.
sex people, then you might never meet up with them. Somebody told me this the other day.
Well, and a lot of women are slow to give people their real phone number to text and get off of the apps because they suspect they're going to get a dick pic. And they often do.
Yeah.
So,
But then for me, because of the thing about the apps being so addictive and then it being implanted in my thing, I want to get off of them because I have a false sense of how much I care about the person because when I see the app notification badge, then I'm too excited.
Yeah.
And I want to regulate my understanding of how much I care about the person based on a regular text notification, not a little Tinder icon or whatever.
well, and the other thing is you may
deep on
have,
this shit.
it depends on what you have set up for your notifications on your phone in general. Like maybe you don't have notifications coming up from your dating
Right.
app, but you do on your text and you actually want to talk to this person. All of this stuff is like very messy.
It's a twisted world.
It is, and it's deep in our brain chemistry.
Yeah.
Okay, obviously there's so much more to say
So much
here.
more.
Riki, thank you for coming on the show. It was really wonderful to get a chance to sit down and talk with you, and I look forward to doing it again already.
Thank you for having me, and I hope to come back again and answer the other questions we didn't even get to. There were so many things we could talk about.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And please subscribe and follow us on Instagram. Follow Riki on Instagram, too. Or put her link, Virtual Riki. And check out the show notes for everything that we talked about and all the links to her stuff and the research. And see you next time.
See you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.